All right, I think we're gonna get started here. First, I want to just say welcome to Design Disruptors, our first of 3 conversations in celebration of MoMA Design Store's pop-up design innovations for women. I'm Samantha Krupnick. I manage events for MoMA Design Store, and we're just so happy to have so many people here. Before we get started with tonight's talk, I wanted to just let you know a few things. During the talk, we encourage you to use the chat to ask questions, share observations, or if you need any technical help. Can everyone find the chat on the bottom of their screen and tell us where you're tuning in from? We'd love to know where you are joining us from all around the world. Myself, Jennifer, and Maggie are going to be on hand from MoMA Retail, and we'll be answering questions about the pop-up or topics related to it. We have Fred and Jeff from MoMA Audiovisual who will help with any technical questions you might have. We'll do our best to answer questions in the chat that come up, and we'll also be earmarking a few questions for a Q&A at the end of the talk. Attendee microphones and video will be off during the entire webinar. The talk is being recorded, and we will post it to the MoMA Design Store YouTube in the coming days. We're also transcribing the event this evening using the automatic captioning software Rev. To view the live transcription, click the closed caption CC button on your screen, then show subtitle. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Che Costello, who is one of the buyers who put together the pop-up design innovations for women and our own Associate Director of Merchandising for MoMA Retail.
Hi, it's so wonderful to have you all here tonight for our discussion about design for women's bodies. And it's really a pleasure for me to welcome our guests. We have Paula Antonelli, the Senior Curator of Architecture and Design at MoMA. She also heads up MoMA's R&D initiative with the mission of exploring new ways of thinking and doing in museums. Anyone who's ever had the pleasure of attending one of her research and development salons knows what a mind-expanding experience that is. We're also welcoming Jimena Acosta-Romero, a curator of contemporary design and art, joining us from Mexico City. Jimena and Michelle Millar-Fisher collaborated on the exhibition, I Will What I Want, Women, Design, and Empowerment. And finally, we have Michelle Millar-Fisher, curator of contemporary decorative arts at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, as well as a former MoMA colleague. Michelle's also the driving force behind designing Motherhood, a project you're going to hear more about later. So welcome one and all. So the occasion of our talk tonight is the recently launched product suite MoMA Design Store featuring design innovations for women. We were inspired to bring this initiative to light to celebrate designers working in this very contemporary moment between the past sense of taboo and talking about women's bodies and the present evolving experience of gender. We've discovered a suite of everyday products conceived to improve and enrich the lives of women through good design. So let's talk about, good design for women. So part of what can define design is where you encounter it. In our pop-up for design innovations for women, we're putting things like tampons and vibrators and breast pumps and sports bra in a design store. And that's something new, and it lets you see these objects in a new light. Our guests tonight have all presented designs for women in exhibitions, and I'm very excited to talk to them a bit about what that means and how that recontextualizes those designs. Paula, your exhibit, Safe and Items is Fashion Modern, were an inspiration in how we were thinking about this project. So I'd love for you to share some of your experience with the exhibitions you've organized and how you've used designs for women within them.
It's funny because we had many conversations before, but just as we were talking tonight, I was reminded of another exhibition that we didn't mention that was called Talk to Me in 2011. But just to backtrack a little bit, I would like to explain to our audience how contemporary design exhibitions happen. Design is about life. We're used to thinking, not the audience here, of course, but in general, people tend to think of design as chairs or like decoration, superfluous or just excessive sometimes features. And instead, design is really about life. It's about real issues. It's about the way we move around the world at all levels of income, at all levels of like situation and age and gender. So it really is about life. And MoMA, which was founded in 1929, had design as part of its mandate since the beginning, because the whole idea was that we would celebrate at the museum the art of our time. And there's nothing timelier than design. So throughout the history of the museum, there's been several exhibitions that touched upon the times, like World War II. After World War II, it was about housing, and it was about how to reconstruct the way we lived. I'm not gonna go into many details, but I can talk, for instance, about these 3 exhibitions, one of which I curated, but the other 2 I didn't. They're just examples. Like 1962 Design for Sport was an exhibition that talked about how sports incorporate both the most advanced technology and also the deepest and wisest knowledge of bodies. And it's very interesting to see also how this wisdom took quite a while to come and really understand women's bodies, but that's for another time perhaps. But that's an example. It was an exhibition that was in the garden of the Museum of Modern Art under a tent, and explored all these different tools for bodies to enhance the strength of bodies. In the middle, you see an exhibition that I curated in 2004 that was called Humble Masterpieces, because it was in a gallery, a small gallery. We were in Queens at that time, that was in the middle of all the big hits of our collection. So it was all in the middle of all the Matisses, Picassos, and Rodins, etc. You had this little belch of a gallery that was rotated amongst the curators. And once it happened to me to have to do an exhibition, and I did this exhibition called Humble Masterpieces that was about everyday objects that are so good that we don't even see them. You know, from ball bearings to the Post-it note to Chupa Chups, you name it. And of course, there are so many of these objects that are not only part of everybody's life, but that are part of women's life. And I regret the fact that we didn't have the tampon, or maybe we did have the tampon already at that time. If it was not at that time, it was shortly thereafter. Another really interesting exhibition is an exhibition that is historical, but it's also very contemporary. Because, you know, one of the ideas behind the Museum of Modern Art is that history is feeding the present times and also a vision of the future. And this exhibition, Designing Modern Women, was organized by Juliet Kinchin, my wonderful colleague that just retired, but really was a pioneer of women's studies, and especially design and women's studies at the Museum of Modern Art. And also it's important to say that this exhibition was part of a really big program called the Modern Women Fund. It was initiated by Sarah Peter, a wonderful donor to the Museum of Modern Art, that generated not only this exhibition, but also a milestone book, Modern Women, Partial History, like a big tome that in a way tried to fill the gaps and the lacunae that happened historically from the beginning of the museum until now. You know, as you know, women were not always the focus of the attention. So there was a canon to rewrite, and there were many gaps to be filled. But I was mentioning to you, Talk to Me in 2011, because that is the one instance where I found myself coping with the prejudice in front of women's bodies and design for women. There was a beautiful piece in that exhibition that is not in the collection that was called a menstruation machine. It was by Sputniko, this great British, Japanese designer, artist, pop singer. And it was a machine that was meant to let either people that don't menstruate, whether they are born male or they are transitioning, etc., but that want to experience menstruation. So it was almost like a chastity belt with electrodes that went down on your abdomen and gave you cramps, and then there was a reservoir for the blood. And it was really incredible to see the reaction that people had to that particular object. So the experience was that. And then if you don't mind going to the next slide, once that ice was in a way broken, there were other exhibitions that addressed design for women. SAFE was in 2006, and that's when we showed for the first time capsters that are for sale at MoMA and that have become part of the collection. That are sports equipment for Muslim women. So they kind of like cover your hair, but still give you the kind of advantage that you need to play sports. And then 2 years ago, I mean, last year, it's almost 2 years ago, it was Broken Nature, the 22nd Triennale di Milano, where we showed a whole section that is about design for women that is also sustainable or more responsible, from the pregnancy kit that is biodegradable to the Ruby cup and other items that try to cope with women's needs, but also produce less waste. Then if you don't mind going forward for another slide, I'm going to talk to you about an exhibition that actually Michelle and I worked on together when Michelle was still at the Museum of Modern Art, which is Items, Fashion, Modern. Items is Fashion, Modern was an exhibition about the 111 items of clothing that had a strong impact on history and on society in the past, say, 110 years. And on the left side of the slide, you see the entry picture, the entry vignette of the exhibition. You have there Spanx, you have there also pantyhose, you also have brief for men, and you have a push-up bra, and also a particular commission that is a pantyhose for people that are on wheelchair, for women that are on wheelchairs. So that was the entrance of the exhibition. And on the right-hand side, you see instead some figurines from 1944, because there was only one exhibition concerning fashion at MoMA before Items is Fashion Modern. It was an exhibition that was entitled Are Clothes Modern? ? So the contemporary title comes from the historical title. And the curator, Bernard Rudowski, commissioned at that time a great sculptor, Costantino Nivola, and asked him to produce statues, sculptures of women's bodies the way they should have been to match the fashion at different times in history. So you can see the constriction, the denaturalization, the deformation of women's bodies for ideals of fashion and of beauty that were not corresponding to reality. And maybe by looking at these figurines, you realize how far we've come. There's still a lot to go. But I have to say that having this conversation tonight, having a collection of items such as the ones that Che and her team have put together, being able to talk to Jimena and to Michelle after the exhibition that they have curated and circulated in the world, and the book that Shell is organizing about motherhood, is really an accomplishment that makes me hopeful and proud.
Same. I think it's inspirational to be able to be having this conversation and to see the way that designs for women have been built into a lot of the exhibitions you've worked on. And even with like Jimena, the exhibition you planned, I Will What I Want, Women Design and Empowerment. I'd love to hear you talk about your thinking around that and how you selected the objects you were featuring in that. And there's a next slide is too. We can move on to the next one.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, Che, for the invitation. I'm super happy to be here with you and with Paula and Michelle. And I think it's like the perfect dialogue, because Michelle and I met through Paula, and that's how we came to collaborate and work on this exhibition and this book. And also Paula have like an introductory essay in the book. So thank you, and I'm happy to be here. And what we did, Michelle and I did at I Will What I Want, Women Design and Empowerment, it was basically trying to figure out, it was kind of a design history that hasn't been really written about or really explored. And it's a design history, like the main question that we had selecting the objects was, what objects have helped women towards equality, towards this quest? So it's like a pattern, it's like a walk, no? So it has been from mid-20th century to the present. So does this has to be related to reproduction, menstruation, fertility, breastfeeding, maternity leaves, policy, all these things that women or people who call themselves a women have to deal with. no? And it is about equity. So we found out that many of the work that we were really interested in, one, hasn't been collected or hasn't been called design, but has been called like a medical supply or has been called technology, and it works in those areas. But when you bring it and you are able to say, this is design, no? We want to take it and bring it to a design context. And I think it's really amazing. We have like a lot of objects related to menstruation, like to contain blood, absorb it. Like, I mean, history of the tampon, I mean, history of the ruby cups, or like the silicone cups. We have like history of how like the contraceptives, right? Because you have the pill, which is like revolutionary in the 20th century, but there's a design attached to it, so people could actually use it and don't miss a day, no? So you have the dial pack, which actually was like designed by a guy that didn't want to get pregnant again, no, with his wife. So it was like, okay, you have to remember to take once a day, please. So, and this is basically the dial pack that we still use. So there are like these micro histories that we went into and we dove into them, and they relate to motherhood, which is amazing that Michelle has like this book and this research and exhibition, because sometimes they go towards motherhood or prevent motherhood. And it's also about like ownership. It's about women getting control of their bodies. It's about human rights, right? Because it's a right to have agency over your body. And I think it's like the big issue that is now the trending topic, at least in Latin America, right? So Michelle, would you like to add something?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So Jimena, absolutely correct. We started collaborating maybe 5 years ago now on I Will What I Want. So it seems like a long time ago. And almost around the same time, I started chatting with someone who I have to mention because she's my work wife and partner in crime, and an absolutely extraordinary design historian, Amber Winnock, who is my partner on designing motherhood. And this book, which comes out next year, is based around the arc of human reproduction. We started looking, really, I was inspired. Amber's had a long history in researching in this area. I was very much inspired by the work I was doing with Jimena. And we were really interested, again, in how the conversation around design for the arc of human reproduction just was not in any kind of history book. It was not something that we'd been taught. It was not something that we could see in exhibitions. It was not something that we were seeing in collections. These were objects, ideas, speculations, systems that were really erased from the spaces in which we were working, and often siloed into a conversation about women. And our argument in this book, the subtitle here is The Things That Make and Break Our Births. And our argument is that absolutely everybody on earth is born. So everybody here tonight got here either through somebody's vagina or their C-section scar. And yet the designs that shape that experience are absolutely excised from the histories that we were learning, that we were teaching, that we were seeing in exhibitions. So Designing Motherhood is a book. You can actually see it on Instagram too, if you want to look at just at Designing Motherhood, at the range of different designs that we encompass. Amber this week was writing on the clear C-section curtain. I was writing about the 1950s baby drawer, where you could pull your baby from the nursery in the hospital into your room and back again, like a filing cabinet. But we've also spoken to people like Thomas Beatty, who was the first man to give birth about 10 years ago. And so really complicating and thinking about what it means to identify through race, through gender, through many different intersections with the material culture that shapes our births and our early years on this planet.
I think looking at these designs for women through an exhibition context, you see how these really simple objects carry with them so much meaning and so much potential for people. I'd love to pivot into talking like more specifically and deeply about, let's start with menstruation, because I think that's like a time in which women first encounter design for their bodies, right? The options they have available to them. Where do you think the biggest innovations for menstruation have been, and where would you love to see us going?
Well, I think like, okay, so like, for example, what we talk about in the book is how like after the war, there was like this big breakthrough of Kimberly Clark because they had to make like cellulose, which is like this cellulose with cotton. So they used it for like war wounds. And after the war, they were like, okay, we have like tons and tons of this material. And actually French nurses started to using it as a pad. So that was like a great hack, right? Like women designed it on the road because they needed it. So they like cut it, paste, they have a sanitary pad. I think that's an awesome, and it came from like actually like a normal civilian designing that. Also, well, like the cups. Now, I just like I have the ruby cup and the silicone cup, but just like the menstrual cups are like great, amazing objects, and they should just like stay. And all the things are like disposable. Should like we should use them less and less. Another amazing invention, I think, is yeah, the birth control, the dial pack, which I mentioned, but you were thinking just menstruation
And we
stuff?
were talking about like some of the ways that menstruation is also, I think there's like a through line too, with like the way all of these things are talked about and marketed and you know, commercialized. We have an image up on our slide of an instance that Jimena, that you'd mentioned, that was I think the first ad that, like, you know, back in the day they would use like this artificial blue liquid, and then recently Kotex used an Instagram ad that actually showed what looked like blood being absorbed by a pad, and how that was sort of a sign of change.
I think that's huge as well, Shay. Yeah, that notion of shame, being able, and I mean, one of the wonderful things about being able to talk this evening quite so openly is about subjects like menstruation, is that it hasn't always been the case. And so definitely when you're thinking about any of, I mean, the menstruation ads that I grew up with, Amber and I were laughing over one of them the other day that may or may not make it into our book, because it was this 1970s woman on a hike with perfect white shorts, who uses white shorts to go on a hike, with her butt absolutely jammed up against her male friend who was on the hike with her, and she was trying to go hiking because she was wearing this feminine sanitary pad which was going to make sure that she didn't leak, because God forbid someone would see that she was on her period. And so I think that that difference in terms of not having to use white clothing, not having to use blue liquid instead of red liquid, and I think, you know, one of the things in my lifetime that has changed that many people will recognize if they've been in the New York subway is the Thinks subway ads. So in 2016, 17-ish, you saw those ads with the suggestive like egg breaking from its shell, or the grapefruit, or the really beautiful folks sort of contorted in various acrobatic poses, not showing anything, you know, lewd or in any way untoward. But apparently they had to go through a huge fight even to show those adverts on the subway. So I think, yeah, the notion of what we'd like to see change or what's different is just not being ashamed of bodily functions.
We have another menstruation slide that I think speaks to that as well.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, Kieran Gandhi, who I know as MIA's drummer. She probably has many other accomplishments, but that's how I know her. But in 2015, and Jimena and I put this in the I Will What I Want exhibition. So that's the slide that you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen. She ran 26.2 miles in the 2015 London Marathon, which is an achievement in and of itself. And all the press could talk about was that she had period blood in between her legs. No one else had pointed out like the sweat, the snot, the tears, like the other bodily fluids that were coming from, you know, thousands and thousands of other runners. It was the fact that she had free blood through, because she just didn't want to have to deal with changing her tampon halfway through her run.
And the logical next step with menstruation is one of the most challenging areas for us to find products, which was menopause. And that was something, Paula, when we met with you, you challenged us to really look hard for, and it's something that really hasn't been spoken about. And because it's not spoken about, it's not being served, but increasingly we're seeing some things.
Well, Michelle Obama just did.
Yes.
She did. I think we have a slide of Michelle Obama and talking about her menopause. And I was so excited, and I was listening to it. I was like cutting fruit in the kitchen. I was like, everyone come in here. Yes.
Definitely. And I'm just looking at, Nancy has a really important question in the chat actually about menstruation. Do women or do menstruating people have to be thoughtful about changing and cleaning the menstrual cup to avoid a risk of toxic shock with its use? I boil mine. And so before I start using it every single month, I just boil it, totally fine. But when I'm using it, I'm wearing it right now, I don't have to do anything but wash it. And when I take it out and then put it back in with using the faucet in the bathroom. So you don't have to be you just have to be sanitary, but it's nothing crazy.
So from the menopause outlook, I know at CES this year, AARP announced that they were going to do a hackathon about menopause. What do you think, what directions would you like to see designers going in with regard to menopause and managing those symptoms?
Good question.
I think
I don't know, like I was like,
no, Jimena, go ahead.
no, I just like, I saw what like the collection that you put together, and there are like some items that are used for menopause, and I would like love to have some. So I don't know, like, it's like, I think no, like you have to try them and then like see, like they use like a feedback from the user, and then you get like the next generation of objects. So like, but like the whole idea of wearing something that actually cools you down, I think it's amazing. So if it works, just like a iteration of those gadgets that cools you down. That's what I think. I don't know. Paola, you were trying to say something?
No, I think it's about, I kind of agree with you, Jimena. We need to study. You know, these are like unexplored territories. There's another question that is really important in the chat that I will bring up later because right now it's not the moment, but unexplored territories, right? So when you and I met, Che, you told me, oh my God, there's hardly anything about menopause. There's like adaptations of other objects. Well, because that's still unexplored. Like for instance, cooling is fine, but you don't go from cold to hot and then to cold with a rhythmic path. Like you don't know how many minutes it's going to take. So there's also that kind of studying and averaging and understanding of the minute details. So we're still at a very macro level. We have to get into the micro. And one could say that menstruation is already far ahead because there's been more conversation about menstruation. And menopause will be one of the next frontiers, I think. And in the end, it's all about normalcy. It's about normalization. It's about catering to the issue, frankly. That's all. I think that's what I hope for. I hope it becomes a design issue that is so normal that some of the best design minds think about it, right? That's my hope.
And with menopause, it kind of shares with some elements of motherhood where you're going through things and you're working in a society or at a workplace that doesn't really make allowances for certain needs you have. So designers are coming in to make hacks, but I'm thinking now about like breast pumps, how they're this amazing innovation, but also they're kind of a solve for the fact that like America at least has very limited maternity leave after you have a child. So people are going back to work. So the breast pumps are amazing, but they're kind of part of another story.
Yeah, I absolutely see the breast pump in the same design history as all of the gadgets that women have been sold usually by men, although it's changing now in terms of some of the breast pump companies being, employing women as designers or as thought leaders. But I think of, the KitchenAid or the Hoover or other types of so-called labor-saving devices where women were told, use this and you'll be able to cut, quote unquote, your work down, the very gendered work of caring or of housekeeping or of doing other kinds of domesticated labor. And so I think it's really interesting the way that breast pumps are marketed as empowering devices. I think they're important. I think that innovation is so very necessary. But I often think that, as you say, given the systems in which we exist in the US, especially, but the world over, that it's often a way for women to do twice as much in half the time, and sometimes doing it in a broom closet rather than in a space that could actually be a nice lactation room or somewhere with some privacy and some dignity. But I see you have the Haka there with Chrissy Teigen, who's one of our Designing Motherhood heroines, and the Haka as a non-electric breast pump, I think, is a fantastic design.
Absolutely. And we wanted to, and we're offering it as part of this product assortment because we wanted to have something that was manual and that was really accessible, like price point wise. That's like great for everyone. And then we're also carrying the LV, which is kind of very high end, beautiful, super quiet breast pump that's being worn in London Fashion Week by that model there. A couple things that you were saying, Jimena, about the medicalization of a lot of these products. And we have a slide that's about advertising and marketing. And I think that that's something that we were seeing happening, and we started pulling together product samples in the realms of, like, you know, everything from like vibrators to period underwear, was the sea change in the way these things were packaged and advertised and where you would see them advertised that made them seem to fit in better in a place like a design store or a department store where they're selling things like these now. And I wanted to just share this slide to get us on the conversation of how those indicators and the way even somebody like Megan Thee Stallion or Cardi B talking about vaginal lubrication create the ability for us to have these conversations.
Right. Now the thing is, I think like more and more, if you take it like, if there's like a communication design like involved in the communication of the product, like you normalize the language, no? You normalize seeing it, using it, the instructions, what it is it for. You get like people like to be kind of curious about it, and that is that. And I just like want like go quick again to the breast pump, because I remember when we did the show, we showed like some of the Medela, like a Medela collection, but it was more about trying to figure out how some technologies changed. And the technology that didn't really change was the part, like all the machinery changed, but the thing that didn't change was the part that goes onto the breast. So that was the same, almost the same piece of plastic. So even though there's like kind of an involvement, like an evolution, sorry, in the machinery, and there are like people and engineers thinking about it, still the part where it touches the breast is like, oh no, you know? So, I mean, there's like, there's so much to go in, like, in that direction, like more research and more also like understanding how the body works and if it's comfortable or not. I just wanted to point that out.
Definitely.
Those questions are so good. But, you know, can I turn the tables around for a second? Because I also want to say, I mean, there are all these milestones. I said 2011, having menstruation in exhibition was a little, and then now we can talk about it easily. Or even just a year and a half ago, it would not be that thinkable to have this collection of products in the museum store, right? So even, you know, the relationship between the MoMA store and the museum is a very curatorial relationship. There's always curators involved with the store, and the store is involved with the curators, meaning that very often we learn from Che and from the other retail specialists about products that we might have not seen before, and they end up being in the collection. So really there's really a lot of porosity between the two departments. So I have tremendous respect for this collection, also from a curatorial standpoint, and I understand the breakthrough. So I would like to ask you, Che, what did you have to go through? How much support did you get? Was it easy to talk about this? I mean, I know that you had a good experience, otherwise I wouldn't ask you, because I wouldn't put you in a strange situation. But can you tell us a little more about how you came up with the idea and how it happened?
Yeah, I would love to. So I was working closely with one of our buyers, Alexandra Glazer, and we had been following, you know, we're always keeping track of different things happening in the world of design. And there were a bunch of different things that seemed unrelated, but we were like really excited to learn about like a bunch of middle schoolers in the Bronx starting podcasts about their period. Oh, that's really exciting. That's really interesting. They feel like they could talk about it. Or we would see like a woman who started her own like sex accessory company because she had cancer in her 20s and she went through menopause early, and she wanted to create designs for women's pleasure made by women. And a number of different stories, or even like the inventor of the sports bra. Like we kind of went in it through like a research mode. And then we were thinking about doing something for NYC by Design in May, which is usually the New York City-wide celebration of design. And we always do a feature on a design movement we think is important during that time. And Alex said, let's do this story of all these designs we're starting to see, because it began with a conversation, but then we started seeing really interesting designs. But I always say, like, the vernacular we use at MoMA Design Store are products you can put on the shelf and you could sell and people could bring home. So let's do that. So we put all the products together and we saw it was a critical mass. We had a story. And then we did have to kind of convince people that it was going to be like a story that would be well received. And we brought it around, and we actually focus grouped it within our office. We had a bunch of little meetings with different women of different ages and backgrounds, just to make sure what we were really doing was helpful and useful. I even consulted with an OBGYN on some of the products to make sure that the products we're offering really were like the best in class and they were making things better. And of course, you sent me back to the drawing board, Paula, with Menopause. So we worked really hard to find that. And when we finally pulled it all together, I think we were so inspired by the voices that originally inspired us, who were talking just frankly about the needs of women's bodies and solving those problems, that was the through line. And it kind of brought us to this moment in which we find ourselves.
Well, big congratulations, because and it also gives us an opportunity to explain to people how these collections happen, because there's a lot of work behind that. So kudos.
And I think one of the areas that was like we kept bouncing back about and was challenging was gender fluidity, because I think that we've all probably experienced, as I know Michelle and Jimena, if when you were doing your projects that were about design for women or motherhood, how you kind of grappled with the fact that, like, always recently took the female symbol off all of their menstrual products because people menstruate who don't identify as being a woman. The period underwear we're selling from Isle, they make a boy short brand for people who are non-binary. So how did you guys think about that?
Being very deliberate with language. So in I Will What I Want, we had folks sensitivity read the language. We were very careful, and the same with Designing Motherhood, to use the phrase pregnant people, postpartum people. Not all women menstruate, and not all people who menstruate are women. And so being very, very careful to think about the historical uses of women too, right? So like in the second wave feminist 70s and early 80s, you'd use women with a Y to think more expansively about the patriarchal roots of the notion of woman. And then more recently, using woman with an X, WOMXN, to indicate a broader kind of intersection of gender that might come under that umbrella of identification. But it's always, I think, a work in progress, because while the notion for us in our book is that, everybody has the universal experience of being born and being shaped by some of those early pieces of design and material culture, everybody's birth and everybody's experience of their reproductive arc is completely unique as well. And so I think it's, for us at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jimena, but definitely when Amber and I are talking, it's always a work in progress. Again, I'll go back to Thomas Beatty, who is the first man to give birth and really make that a kind of a public education for people in terms of him being very, very open about his experiences. He talks about the notion of masculine pregnancy and calling himself, as he identifies, using he pronouns and as a father, and really challenging people to think much more expansively about experiences that have been handed down to us as stereotypes or just, one thing rather than many things.
One of the products that I'm most fond of that we found was Period the board game, which was made by some RISD graduates, where you get to like turn the ovaries and find out whether you're having a good day or a bad day, and it's really educational and fun. And one of the things that that made me think about was, what are other educational opportunities designers could have to like normalize these conversations?
Teach this in design school, like make this a problem in design school, which we're doing actually for Designing Motherhood. We're pairing with a really amazing design professor, Orkan Talhan at UPenn. And so that's a sort of dedicated part of the Designing Motherhood project. But as Paula was saying, like, make this a conversation that's just completely normalized, so that from the very earliest moment, folks are not just thinking, again, as Paula said, about designing cute chairs or a car or some other kind of product, that this is part of their lexicon of design from the very beginning. But I don't know what you both think.
I got distracted because, like, there's like people in the chat talking about pelvic floor health.
Yeah, let's
Great.
talk about pelvic floor.
So, yeah.
No, there are some pretty great questions in the chat, and there are also some amazing areas that maybe are not for the store, but I'm sure that Jimena and Michelle are taken care of in their curatorial work, from incontinence to miscarriage to even abortion, you know, just like the design issues surrounding these really difficult and sometimes tragic or critical moments in a woman's life. So that's really, and then some people were also talking about sex toys and pleasure. I don't know if you want to also address that, Che.
Yeah, definitely. Let's start with pelvic floor, because I know that's something kind of like menopause and somewhat related to it is really underserved. And I think someone mentioned in the chat about the LV pelvic floor trainer, and we are offering that. It's a smart device that gives you like little workouts, but I think there's probably more awareness and education that people could get. I think in America, at least, people are often told like incontinence is part of life. So, you know, get your whatever female diapers, but there really are things you can do to improve the incontinence. So a lot of these designs are not only for women, but most of them are by women, right? Because women had to find these solutions. And I think that sex toys is really relevant to that. Have you all included those types of products in any of your exhibitions?
Totally, yeah. Like the Leah pregnancy test that Paula was talking about, it was in Broken Nature. We also had it in Designs for Different Futures at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Leah is two really amazing young women who came out of design programs in Philadelphia and decided to modernize the pregnancy test, which up until this point in time has been a single-use disposable plastic thing. The pregnancy test, not many people know this, but the original designer of the pregnancy test, Meg Crane, is still alive and very well, living in Manhattan. She's an amazing person who, when she was in her mid-20s, designed the at-home pregnancy test in 1969-1970 for Organon, a pharmaceutical company based in New Jersey. But yeah, Leah is one of these products that two young women.
You wanted to carry Leah very badly. It wasn't ready for us, but
I want to try Leah. I don't even need to be pregnant. I just want
I've tried it. I've tried it. I got a sample.
I have not.
It worked perfectly. I product test everything rigorously here.
And just, it's a biodegradable pregnancy test, so it flushes away.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Because the plastic parts in the pregnancy test have no function. They're just kind of like the holder.
And
just throw it away.
Shall we move to the Q&A? We have so many amazing questions. If you guys glanced any questions that I missed, feel free to jump in with it. Paula, you said you had something good.
Yeah, I saw one that was interesting from Gerardo Rojas, which will be the impact of having exhibits focused entirely on women, especially in light of the current questioning of patriarchal structures. And personally, I would like to tell you one thing. It's almost like a pain you have to go through. I'm hoping that we will not need to have exhibition on women very soon. You know what I'm saying? It's like we have to do it because we have to create new baselines for discussion so that then we can move on. So I think that the impact will be the same that we mentioned when we were talking about being able to talk about menstruation. So you break the ice, you normalize a conversation, and then you can move on to new issues. So that's what I'm hoping. I don't know if you have any answer to that too.
Yes, definitely. I mean, like even like one in like academic discussion, like inside MoMA, inside like the forum of discussing this in like this design history context, but also like in the way you're doing, Che, in the store, like putting up sex toys because pleasure is part of life, and they're like such as amazing and sophisticated objects that you should know about. It's also educating. It's also like putting forward, the necessity, the item, and as Paula said earlier, design is part of life. So this is changing every day, right? Like understanding your body, like your partner's body. So I think pleasure, it's really important. And also abortion, I don't know how to solve that. It's like really, like we were thinking about how to move forward, like in all the different questions about like human rights and women's rights and abortion. And I always think about communication being part of the abortion mixture, like instead of an object, we're thinking about more like laws, and thinking about more like legislation and design communication. But I can't think about like a situation that like breaks through and gives like an object as a solution. I don't think it's an object. What do you think, Michelle?
Actually, so there's a very underground object that's so I will say also framing I think is important. Go back to the exhibition question, Shay. Like the things that make and break our birth, so designing motherhood, is not an exhibition about women. We think it may be because that's the way we've been taught to understand motherhood or birth, but birth is how everybody got here this evening. And so it's a very, very universal design question. What I will say about abortion, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the Del M extraction kit, but it was the kit that you could basically make yourself. If you've ever read Our Bodies Ourselves, or if you have a copy of that book anywhere, then the earlier versions of it and some of the literature around the second wave feminist movement, this was basically like a jam jar with a suction kit, and it was a way of being able to perform your own menstrual extraction, which if done early enough could also be an abortion. And so used in the US and in other places, Bangladesh and other places as well, where it's actually legal to use up until a certain week post last menstrual period. But there are always DIY solutions that have been designed for women by women. And they just haven't always necessarily been on the shelves of our stores for very obvious reasons, as you point out, Jimena, due to legislation, policy, and public expectation.
So many great questions here. There's a question about what's the biggest shift you'd like to see in the next 5 years about how designing for women is seen. To some degree, I think Paula addressed that with it sort of moving on, but any other thoughts?
You want to go, Jimena? I have thoughts, but go ahead.
Go, the speculum. I hate it.
Yona, I love. So Yona, thinking about like the holistic approach to pelvic exams, I think they just wrote a really interesting article. I'll see if I can find the link and I'll put it on the chat, but about the pelvic exam and the ways in which they're redesigning it. I want to see more women in charge of making decisions. When Amber and I first put our book out there, Paula helped midwife it. She read our proposal. It wasn't terrible. And we sent it out to so many places. And this was 3 years ago. No one looked at it. And then Me Too happened and Time's Up happened. And then people suddenly thought, wait a second, maybe women should be telling their own stories. What was that book proposal again? And that's how we got our book publisher. And so I just feel if more women were in places of power, they were the book publishing people, they were the people who were making decisions about what exhibitions we get to see, what products we get on shelves, how they're framed, how they're advertised. I think that makes a difference. And so that's the difference I'd like to see.
Yeah. One of the questions that surprised me, and what's been so exciting about working on this design feature, is the blind spots I keep finding within myself. And one of them is a question that we got about what about design for women after menopause? I've been so focused on trying to find something for menopause. What about after menopause? Have you all heard of any projects or designs related to those areas? Maybe that's the next thing. But
thank you. Blind spot also.
Yeah.
We'll work on it. We promise.
Yeah. That, and I think I'm very excited about design for gender fluidity as well, which is something that in the same way we started watching the products associated in this product feature, we've started seeing things coming up that are important in addressing real world needs and improving lives in that area. Okay, so there's a couple questions about why talking about these things is still taboo. And I barely remember that because I've been talking about it so much lately, but I think there's enough of them so that we could acknowledge that there still isn't a huge comfort level for everyone talking about these things. Thoughts?
I mean, I still grew up in a moment in time where, again, going back to the beginning of our conversation, you saw blue liquid instead of red talking about menstrual blood on adverts. You were told the most awful thing that could happen to you at school is that someone would see that you got your period before you realized you did and it was on your clothes for some reason. Women are still expected to hide out in a broom closet to pump. All of the above, all of these things. We're taught by a society that these bodily functions are shameful or they are devalued. Most of the care work that is done for younger people, older people around, mothering of any kind is heavily gendered, is not, in any way valued by US society, most societies that tell you to go home and do it for free and then come back, 10 days to 8 weeks later into your workplace and act like it never happened. So I think that these things are taboo because we don't really have a fully formed society in which people who menstruate, people who are pregnant, people who have menopause, people who are postpartum can bring their full selves to a public place.
And that's why I think legislation and guidelines are important, because I think that the level of discomfort that Michelle is talking about is just part of our education, as she said. So in order to all be able to sit around the table, people of all genders, and talk about different topics, we need to be almost forced to talk and listen, and guidelines and laws can help us do so, right? So whether you have a discomfort or not, you go through your own growing pains, but the legislation or the rules, the communal rules, are that you should be able to talk about it. I like that because I also have to push myself.
I think one of the areas that has been most concerning in our research is period poverty, right? If you can't talk about it and it's taboo, we're ignoring the fact that everyone can't necessarily afford to have those menstrual products. And if no one's comfortable talking about it, no one's going to solve for that.
Right. Or just like making sure that you can get them when you are a person who is incarcerated, for example. So whether you are, a person who may be experiencing being without a home at present, yes, absolutely. And so
homeless shelters, it's one of the things that people are looking for the most that nobody ever thinks to donate.
Yeah. Going back to something that Michelle said and Paula, I was just listening to a podcast in The Guardian, and they were talking about how gender equity may, because of the COVID-19, may have just paused and went back for a generation, because about mothering and the person that takes care of the family is a woman, right? Generally, it's gendered labor. So 80% of women are right now homeschooling and really not working, or working half part-time, or losing their job. All sorts of situations that are really, really endangering livelihood and savings and going into poverty. So going back to Michelle's argument, it's totally about the labor, and the labor is gendered, and it's about mothering, taking care of someone else, right? So
along those lines, Samantha, I don't know if you all have read Jenny Brown's Birth Strike, but it's a fascinating, somewhat provocative, and I maybe don't buy all of the argument, but it's a beautifully written and very smart book, pointing out that why pay women, pregnant people, predominantly women, for doing something that they're doing for free, producing the next generation. They don't require a wage for that. If you tell them that they're not going to get paid maternity leave, if you tell them that there's no social safety net, this is labor that the country can extract without having to pay for it, without having to have any kind of social safety net for. And so she was saying one of the things that we can do around our reproductive labor is to strike, to make sure that the birth rate precipitously declines until policy has to be changed, because otherwise there's going to be a kind of an extinction event in a country. It's obviously somewhat provocative and speculative in nature, but it's an interesting way of looking at that labor question.
Of course, yeah.
All the hidden labor, unpaid labor at home, this is a big deal. No, I love, this is another blind spot, so thank you.
And
we have time for maybe one more question. Does anyone see one that you want to tackle, or let me see?
There's so many good ones here.
Yeah.
I love, so Nidhi, Josh was talking about the PhD work of Leah Tiddy. I just want to plus one that. I don't know it, but the normalization of sex in all members of society. I want to call out actually an amazing painter that I know, Samantha Nye, whose work talks about eroticism in queer communities over the age of 55. And her work is chef's kiss good. And absolutely looking at a section of society that often isn't allowed to be seen as sensual or sexual. So I think that's an important one to plus one.
There's another observation here that is interesting that intersects with everything else, which is religion. You know, there's Cheryl Rosenberg that talks about Orthodox Jews that also have rules when menstruating, but you know, different religions also come into play, right? And even in that case, they complicate the situation even more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What's the one book, I guess, the question I have for all of us, what's the one book or one resource that you would give to the next generation of younger folks coming up? I know that I wish I'd always had a copy of Our Bodies Ourselves at age 14. I didn't get it till I was 34. I wonder if you all have like something that you're like, this is what people should have.
Well, yes, this one people should have right now.
Nice.
Feminism for the 90%, a manifesto. But like it's like Nancy Fraser and Cynthia Rusa, but it's like actually like talking about this, like all this labor, and actually it's like a call to arms, but like a really beautifully written. But I think it's that, it's like about thinking about human rights and thinking about women's and people's rights and how are we going to get ahead as a society if we don't talk about these issues.
I have one. It's not necessarily about feminism, but it is. It's Barbara Ehrenreich, and it's Nickel and Dimed. So it's about the impossibility of surviving at minimum wage. So that's maybe one of the books that struck me the most in my life. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I learned a lot from the Vagina Bible by Dr. Jen Gunter. She just really explained everything. And she also is the OBGYN who wrote the New York Times article about the Cardi B song, kind of the WAP, and why it is so important to highlight that a lot of people think there's something wrong with them, but the fact that there's a song is helping educate people that it's normal, healthy. Okay, this is amazing. I think we may have to wrap up, but when we began this initiative, one of our goals was to begin dialogue and conversation. And I feel like the conversation in the chat is like amazing and taking on a life of its own and almost as rich as our own. I would love to invite all of the attendees to come back for our future talks. We have one activity for women coming up on September 9th. I'm moderating that panel. And then there's one on the 23rd about good design for pleasure and sex positivity. So that one should be really exciting. And that's going to be moderated by my colleague, Alexandra Glazer. So definitely come back for that. But I guess I just want to thank you all for coming tonight, and especially thank my guests for being an inspiration and being here for this.
Thank you, Che. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. So nice to be here with you.
It was super nice. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. This is terrific.
Please, somebody save the chat. So many good questions and sources.
Okay, I'm going to save the chat. Save chat. Chat save.
Cool. Should I we're done?
We're done. We're good. Thank you so much.
Chase. Okay. Thank you.